you can always get at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can call at 615-956-3912. And if I don't answer right away, then just leave me a message and I'll get back with you. All right, so the agenda for tonight, I'm going to go over some admin stuff, just about like what we're going to talk about, what we're going to do with the, again, what the agenda is and the whole purpose of this. I'm going to get into the role of security for houses of worship because it's a, we'll get into the strategy and functions, all that, but it's a little bit different for us. We're going to talk about creating written plans, what that looks like for you guys or what you're looking for. I'll touch on armed and unarmed security programs, and then I'm just going to open up for Q&A, and I'll go over that in just a minute. So for any questions that anybody has. All right, so we'll just cover the admin stuff real quick. This is the way that I take a look at church security. And so the reason I put this up here, so you know where I'm coming from. I've got a military background. My first degree was in business because I thought I wanted to be a U.S. Marshal when I got out of the Marine Corps, until I figured out what U.S. Marshals really do. So I went and got a business degree for a specific reason to join that agency, and then I happened to work for them later on and decided I didn't want to do that. So my first degree was in business, and then I went back and got another bachelor's degree and then a master's in security once I entered the security field. And then I've got a bunch of study stuff from overseas, from Israel and from some other places. And of course, military background. And I was in the Marine Corps. I was a police officer for 12 years in Nashville. And then after 9/11, went to work for the National Nuclear Security Administration and was in a full-time SRT capacity for them. And then later on went into doing vulnerability and risk assessment work for them, for Department of Energy sites, and then got into physical security management program design for big, large companies, commercial nuclear first, and then for companies like Facebook and Asurion and other companies, just similar. And that's where this comes from. So it's a mix of this background, which really my military and law enforcement background has really not done much for me in physical security because it's two separate functions. And then, of course, my faith-based security is in 2013 forward, I started doing consulting work, and that started with some affluent private schools here in the Middle Tennessee area, putting in armed programs, arming their teachers, doing risk assessments for them, telling them what physical protection systems they needed. And then, of course, I manage a big program for a big mega church here in Nashville, Tennessee, or Brentwood, Tennessee, and Franklin, where we've got almost 100 volunteers that help us with a very comprehensive physical protection program. So I tell you that just so to let you guys know, especially if there's pastors or facility folks on here that are trying to figure out how you do this. This comes completely from a physical security design concept, not law enforcement or military. It's great if you got that background, but that's not where this comes from. This comes from two places: the design piece, and then, of course, the faith-based piece, which this is all about Jesus Christ and God. This is who we serve first. And so we design our physical protection programs around that, okay? And so that's who we give the glory to for all this. All right, so the purpose for this is, and I've said this already, so, man, if you're a pastor, you're a church admin, some sort of facility director, you're a security manager for your church, you're some sort of a volunteer, this provides you with an idea of what a process-driven physical security implementation looks like. Like, what does this mean from a process-driven approach? Because I don't see this. I do this all over the country, do it pretty much full-time for a big church, and then do it, all over the country for churches and synagogues. I don't see process-driven implementation on this. It's like really, this stuff is kind of just pieced together. And then at the end of this, the Q&A is so you guys can ask questions. And of course, I can't be on that long, but I'll stay on until I pass out, until I fall asleep. So we'll try to limit this. And I hope you guys have a lot of questions, because that's what this is about, trying to pass this and get you guys in the right direction. Okay. Let me go over some expectations real quick. I don't hear any feedback, so I think everybody's on mute, which is good. On the Q&A, if you're new to Zoom, if you look at the bottom here, you're going to see something where it says chat. So at the end of this, you can go into chat there, and you can just ask the question that way, and Brandon's going to help me with that. And what I'll do is I'll read the question and then answer it, and that's going to be during the Q&A stuff. So there's two parts. There's a general presentation, which we're going to do the first, I don't know, probably 20 minutes maybe, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. But during the Q&A, if you want to ask a question, go into chat, type it in. I'll try to, or Brandon will, as fast as we can, we'll look at it. I'll read the question aloud, and then I'll answer the question for you. Then you can go into React, and if you hit the React button, you'll see something where it's like, it says raise your hand, and then a little thing will come up and it'll show me that you're raising your hand, and I'll just say, hey, what's your question? And then you can come off mute and you can ask. Okay. And so that way we're not stepping over each other or doing anything. There's not a bunch of, just a lot of, feedback, and there's a bunch of noise, and it doesn't disturb anybody. Okay. So that's how you'll ask questions during the Q&A if you're new to this. All right. So if we have pastors or we have folks that are like facility directors, they're trying to figure out how to do this, or if you're new to physical protection or physical security, you're going to hear these terms. So I'm just going to go over these terms real quick. And I do this for any presentation I do, whether I'm training somebody, whether I do a risk assessment or like a general physical security assessment for you. You're going to see terms and definitions, in those documents or any presentation, just to know what I'm talking about. So adversary is the bad guy. We're trying to protect. That's some sort of threat we're trying to protect the church from. Asset is anything that has a positive value to you guys or something you're trying to protect. And for the most part, in houses of worship, we're talking about people. There are some larger churches that have some assets that may want protection or that need to be protected. And if that's the case, I'll address that. But for the most part, we're talking about people here. EAP stands for Emergency Action Plan, which I'm going to talk about that later on. LLEA is just your local law enforcement agency that is your primary responder if you were to call 911. PSP stands for Physical Security Plan, which again, I'll talk about that in written plans. Response are actions that somebody has to take to neutralize some sort of a threat or problem. And that doesn't mean like the use of firearms. It could just mean you go to interdict, you go to, to talk to somebody in a behavioral threat detection process to try to validate whether or not that's truly a threat. So neutralization doesn't necessarily mean the use of deadly or lethal force. Risk is your church's exposure to some kind of hazard, and that is identified usually in your physical security assessment. And then, of course, threat is, there's two definitions. One could be any indication, circumstance, or event that could compromise the asset you're trying to protect, or it could mean, based on a measurement in your threat assessment, the intent and capability of the adversary. Okay, so it could mean a couple things. Threat assessment is just when we analyze those threats that we've identified in that assessment process. And a vulnerability is just a system weakness. And what that means is normally it's something that you're not doing, that there's an opportunity there for you guys to do something different to protect those assets, right? So those are just basic terms and acronyms, okay? We'll get into
the charger, okay? For the new phone.
Put you on mute. Guys, just remind everybody, if you're new to Zoom, if you're not on mute, if you would mute if you're mute for me, and if not, I'll try to go through there and do that. But that takes time away from the presentation. So if you guys just remember, put your stuff on mute there. Okay, so we kind of get in here to what is the role of security when it comes to houses of worship. All right, make sure I'm gonna get on the chat here. Just make sure I don't have anybody asking a question now. Okay, so what is the role of security in houses of worship? Primary, your mission is no different than any other ministry because this is a ministry. This is not, security should not be separated from the other ministries. If you're part of a church and you've got volunteers and you're an in-house function, it is a ministry. There is a mission statement and it should go along with that house of worship. So there's no difference between what you are doing from a ministry standpoint than anybody else. So you've got a primary purpose, which is service to those congregants and serving Jesus Christ and the bride of the church. That's it. Now you've got a function. You are there for protection, but this should also be it is a mission, and this is a ministry first. And then we go into the protection piece. And so you should be doing things like fellowship. So you should be fellowshipping with the people that are serving on that ministry. You should be fellowshipping with other ministries. And then, of course, with the congregants also, you should be doing, there's some value-added services that you guys should be paying attention to make sure not only that you're protecting, but you're also serving. So, you're literally in this as a ministry. And it's no different than any other ministry, the children's ministry, men's ministry, whatever. If you're doing this correctly, that's what it looks like. So it doesn't conflict with the church. Primarily, physical protection is about prevention. It is not about response. We are not police officers. Law enforcement officers, by the design of our constitutional republic, are designed to respond to something to ensure that a crime has not been committed. And if it has, They either have probable cause, a warrant, or they see that crime. And so with those elements, they make some sort of an arrest and put that person through the criminal justice system. That response is the job of law enforcement primarily. Our job in physical protection is to prevent something from occurring, to stop it from happening. Now, in the functions, and we'll talk about that later on, there is a response function, but we want to try to stay away from that if possible, especially from intentional threats, because it's dangerous, number one. Number two, we may not be successful. Number three, it opens the church up and us for liability. So our primary function outside of the ministry to serving Jesus is actually to prevent things from occurring, not to respond. Okay, response is a function or is a primary function for law enforcement, not for us. It is a function, but it's always last. And I'll go over that when we get into that, when we get into the physical protection piece. And then, of course, again, there are functions, which, and that is like we try to deter, psychologically impact the motivation of the adversary for attacking our church. We try to detect things, which is we try to observe any adversary activity early, or we see it early. We delay, which means we slow down the progress of the adversary. But then that last function is always going to be denial or response, which is actions we take to neutralize that threat. Now, there are the functions which are going to be there, and primarily it's always going to be detection and deterrence, we hope. But strategy is different. The strategy for us, even though we have the functions of any other physical protection system, whether it's a nuke site, a chemical facility, a data center, a corporate center, whatever, the functions are the same, but the strategy for us is different. And this is number one, where the ministry ties in. And number two, our strategy is not to lock all the doors and keep people out. Let's get in the mission piece of it, but gets in our strategy piece. We are commanded as believers to spread the good news of the gospel. And the gospel is that God saves sinners who deserve to burn in hell. And so to do that, we've got to let people in, and we need to let them hear the good news. And locking doors and patting people down and telling people they can't come in unless we determine that they're a threat, obviously, is not a good strategy. And so our strategy around physical security has to look like, hey, we're implementing something where open access and the ability to move around freely in our spaces is the primary mission. And we do that differently. The strategy for that is very different than it would be for a nuclear site or like an airport. And what I see, unfortunately, is people take those strategies from those places like TSA or their workplace or whatever, and they try to put that in a church and it conflicts. And here's the bad thing with conflicting with a mission. We don't do what we are commanded to do, number one, as believers. Number two, we're going to turn people away. And there's a huge impact if we're turning people away. We don't want to do that. So the role of security in houses of worship, the functions are the same. The strategy is different. And believe it or not, even though the functions are the same, we've got different strategies. We still meet the end goal of protecting those assets. But remember, this is a ministry first, and our strategy is always different. And man, I can't stress that enough. Now, with written some questions, and some of you guys record this. This is recorded anyway. So, or take a picture of this, screenshot, whatever. Some basic questions you need to ask when you start talking about written plans, because I get a lot of questions. People are like, "Hey, do you have a use of force plan? Do you have, or like a procedure? What are you doing from a physical security standpoint? How do you write these things down?" Some things to remember on a written plan. Some questions you need to ask yourself. Number one, like, what is it you're protecting? The first thing I need to decide is, what are we protecting from the church? And I don't see that a lot. I see, hey man, we want to go get guys with carry permits, or we're going to get some people that'll sit in the sanctuary like covertly, and they're going to respond to an active assailant. I'm not saying those things aren't good, but I'm just saying the first question is, what are you trying to protect? Like in physical protection, we start talking about functions in physical security plans. That's the first thing I need to ask, man. What is it that has a positive value to us, and how do we protect it? Number two, the second question is, what are you protecting those assets from? What are you trying to protect the assets from? So, and I don't see this a lot. I do a lot of work for, houses of worship that are not Christian. And I just finished an assessment for one of those organizations. And a couple of years ago, they had an outside organization that fits in with their belief systems that come in to do an assessment primarily so they could get funding off of a FEMA, off of a DHS grant. And I got to see that assessment that they had done earlier. It's from a big organization. And I was very surprised at the poor quality of the assessment. There wasn't even a threat assessment in the assessment. There was no threat assessment. So it didn't really even explain what they were trying to protect their assets from, which really shocked me. So the second question we need to ask, which is really the threat assessment, is what are we trying to protect the assets from? Because that's how we're going to implement. Number one, that implements our strategy and what it is we need to do. And number two, that's going to tell us where our vulnerabilities are. And so that's the next question. How are your assets compromised? And that gets into the vulnerability piece. What are we not doing? So based on what it is we're trying to protect our assets from, what are we not doing? So where are we compromised? What needs to be done in the future to protect these assets? And then, of course, what are the requirements to do that? Like, what are the resources? What are we going to need? So when you start looking at written plans, and this covers your physical security assessment, emergency action plan, physical security plan, this covers all those. So these are your basic questions that should be asked, okay? From when we start looking at a really process-driven approach. And here are the written plans. One, and a lot of people say, well, we don't have a lot of resources. Well, I'll tell you, if you don't at least have a threat assessment done, then you're going to be chasing your tail forever on this thing. So the first written plan really should be a physical security assessment, or what we call a PSA. And a lot of times that's probably an outside resource, right? So, and this could be something as simple as a survey where somebody kind of comes in and doesn't do a threat assessment. So a survey is where I go online and I find some kind of a compliance document that's got some checks, it's like a checklist, and I go through and look to see if the church has those things. Well, there's nothing really wrong with that, except number one, that's not a threat assessment. Number one, it's not an asset assessment either. So it doesn't tell you what you're trying to protect the threats from. And number two, it doesn't tell you what the threats are. It's just working off somebody else's compliance or what they believe that you need to do. And if that's what you're getting, you probably need to go back and you need to reassess that. So the physical security assessment does provide you with, man, what are you trying to protect? What are you trying to protect those assets from? Where are your system weaknesses? And what do you need to do next? That is what the physical security assessment does. And that does require some education, some training and certification. Okay. So just remember that when we talk about the PSA. Your second written document, which is pretty important. And if you're a small ministry, you could probably use this document as your procedures, and that is your emergency action plan. Your emergency action plan is going to highlight what those hazards are, how you guys are exposed to them, and how you guys respond to them, and what training is required to do that. And so a lot of times people look at this as a crisis management plan or whatever, but your emergency action plan, it is needed. That is your second written plan. And then your physical security plan just documents what you're doing. And sometimes this is required, especially for like contract labor, if you're hiring people to do this. Sometimes this is also required if there's some sort of state requirement to have like a physical security program, even if you're volunteering. So if there's some state requirements, even for volunteers, this is a good idea. This is a good plan to have. And also if you've got succession planning, which means, let's say you've got a volunteer that steps in to manage this. And, volunteers don't last forever, right? They're not designed to. And so that person that's managing this or leading it steps off. Then if you've got this written down in a physical security plan, you just pass that off to the next person and your succession planning is taken care of. So that next person can take this. So they've got this written down in a physical security plan. So when we start talking about written plans, these are the three plans I would always say you need to pay attention to. Now, there's always a big question about, man, do I arm my folks up? I'm going to say something that always creates emotions. Okay. And I am a gun guy. My entire life, I joined the Marine Corps at 17 and I went, got selected for Fast Company out of the grace of God. And so I joined as an infantryman and got selected to go to Fast, and then got out and was a SWAT team guy full time, and then went to work for the National Nuclear Security Administration. And they spent a lot of money training me on how to lead big full-time SRT teams to protect weapons. They taught me how to do risk assessments. And they taught me how to measure the effectiveness of armed response teams. And I took that into commercial nuclear, and I got recruited into that environment to design those teams for those facilities. And then I've been doing this for houses of worship and other types of facilities for actually now since 2013. So it's been quite a long time. So I say all that to tell you, like, I'm an armed guy. Like, I like guns, and it's good to have them, especially if an adversary gets into your location and there's not, if the off-site response is a long way away, right? Which they always are. But guns don't protect facilities. Let me say that one more time. The gun doesn't protect anything, and it does not deter anything either. If that were true, we'd have no school shootings. We'd have none. So the gun is not your primary tool for preventing violence. It doesn't prevent anything. It's a tool of response only. And so I tell people, man, you need a really good behavior threat detection program before you need to put guns on site, because guns, especially when you start talking about volunteers, it creates a certain amount of risk. There's liability associated with it, and you need to figure out if your insurance company, which we're going to get into next, or your church is able, if they actually want to accept that risk. Okay. So insurance. So before you go armed and even unarmed, have a conversation with your insurance company. I've talked to churches where they brought me in to put in armed programs, and then what happens afterward? They have a conversation with their insurance company, their current provider, and then find out that that insurance company won't cover it. Most do, but some will not, and so you just need to have a conversation with them first before you put in any program, especially if it's armed. Um, Threat assessments. Does your threat assessment at your church call for an armed program or unarmed? Like, what does your threat assessment call for? What does it say? What are those things that are compromising those assets? And does that require some sort of an armed program? So I would always say, ask that question. Um, Risk, and I've already talked about this, but is the church, especially if it's going to be armed, is the church willing to accept that risk? And again, this goes back to the insurance. What does this look like for your insurance company? And when we start talking about insurance and self-defense plans also, if you've got, especially if you've got armed responders that are, especially if they're volunteers, do they have something that's going to help them also? Do they have self-defense plans just in case they do have to use deadly force to get into it? If you guys are using contract labor, because I provide contract labor for churches all over Middle Tennessee, and I'm now moving into Alabama to do this, man, what's their insurance look like? Need to ask those questions. Always get COIs or copies of their certificates of insurance to ensure that the coverage is there that you need, right? And then, of course, who's going to manage this, whether it's armed or unarmed? Who's going to manage the program? So somebody needs to lead this, and it needs to be somebody it needs to be somebody that's fixed on security. I'm not saying that the facility manager can't lead it or some other ministry leader, but man, especially if you've got more than a couple people and you've got more than 100 people in your church, you probably need at least a volunteer that's going to manage this, for you, and take that away from somebody else that's trying to manage other functions. Okay. And I'll skip this video, but it just kind of gets into the armed response piece. There's no requirement for anybody to respond to include the police. So it's always good to have somebody manage the program. Okay. So that's just a process driven approach, a really quick, just a quick introduction to what a process driven approach to this looks like when you're talking about implementing physical protection programs. I want to open it up for questions and answers now. And so I'm going to try to do this as painless as possible. So again, if you want to do this, you can go down to the chat box and we'll see the chat, and Brandon's going to help me with it, or you can always raise your hand and I should be able to see them. So I want to open it up now for Q&A. If anybody's got any questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand, or you can you can fill out something. You can send it through the chat there. Okay, so I've got one question here. So if you have security volunteers, a staff, security director, and law enforcement officers who under contract working for the church, what's the best model you're saying for who directs the police officer on normal operations? Good question. So the first answer to that would be, are you like a proprietary security organization? So are you paying them directly? So like, are they like 1099 contractors where you're paying them directly and they're not really working for the police department? And if that's the case, it would be good for them to fall under security and they should answer to you. If you're paying the police department, so if they're working through like secondary employment, then that means they're actually working for the police. Like they're actually on the clock. And so they're going to have procedures that are police related that they have to follow. So it'd probably be good for the police department to manage that. You're just kind of the go-between. You just need to make sure that they're doing everything that they should do. Now, there's a scope, right? You're going to expect them to do certain things like direct traffic or be present. So again, you need to oversee that. But if they're working for you as 1099 contractors, you need to oversee it. because they're actually working for you. But if they're working through the police department, then they're going to have their own policies and procedures. And of course, what that means is they're going to have to go by their procedures that the police department provides for them. And they be integrating that one chain of command absent a criminal act, and I think that's the answer would be the same. So again, if you're paying the police department and they're working on the clock, that goes towards their retirement. That's through secondary employment. Then they need to go through the police department on that. But again, if they're 1099 contractors, they need to answer to you. Always need more volunteers, but it's challenging to find people who are both qualified and also willing. Um, Absolutely. Let's see. So, do you have any recommendations? Will the PowerPoint be available? Brandon or I will send out the link to where you will have this access to this for at least 24 hours. Okay. Make sure I'm not missing anybody. Do you have any recommendations for finding qualified volunteers and screening for who would fit well with the security mission with the church? As a team lead for team volunteers, always need more volunteers, but it's challenging. Yeah. So first of all, I think the first step in that is everybody, unless they've got a physical ailment that keeps them from able to stand somewhere at least or observe, even if they can like watch cameras, if that's what you've got, try to make it to where everybody serves. I'll tell you the process, and Diane, I'll get to you in just a second, ma'am. The process here would be one. Here's where we've been successful. One, recruitment is very specific to security. Number one was we used to announce this in the church. We're stopping to do that now because we found out that doesn't really add any value to us. So it's very specific for recruitment to security, even though it's still a ministry. Two, set expectations. So right away have an interest meeting. And so when they come in, tell them what the expectations are. And most of the time, about 50% of the people that show up when you show those expectations are going to leave because they know right away what's expected and what's not. And then design the program to where anybody can serve pretty much, unless they can't see or they've got a physical disability. I've got some folks, we've got a large ministry and the majority of them are armed. 98% of the folks are armed out of the almost close to 100 people that we have. And I've got some guys that are in their 70s. And so they're able, then they go through some pretty, they go through training, but I'm able to, through that training process, I'm able to evaluate them in the process. So it's expectations, set those expectations, number one, explain that to them, have some sort of training program, and then you can kind of monitor them in that training program. And through the training program, you may, eliminate some of those folks. So I don't know if I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's what we're doing. And that's where we found success. So expectations, make sure that, it's something that they can do. Don't go into it. I see people they try to design programs that primarily are trying to exclude somebody. Don't design a security program that's going to exclude folks. If they can stand and they can observe, because I've got two parts to it. I've got like the basic part where it's a lot of observation and reporting and just medical response. And then I've got a second portion where it gets into the arm and, we've got just a small percentage to say, we're just going to go through phase one. We're not going to do phase two. We're not comfortable being armed. That would be another way to do it. So you're not excluding anybody. So if that answers your question. If someone in security manager role does not have a CPP or PSP certifications, where's a good place for them to start with doing the security risk assessment? Let me address that. Dan, as you probably know, so yeah, I've been in ASIS for almost 20 years. I'm a CPP, PSP. I managed Middle Tennessee. I've been the chapter chair here for 5 or 6 years, and I've managed chapters all over the country. I love ASIS, but CPP or being a CPP or PSP does not. I'm going to say this, and ASIS would have fit if I said it, but I don't. It doesn't matter. It's true. It doesn't teach anybody how to do a risk assessment. Like the PSP certification didn't certify. I knew how to do that before. So, um, uh, where you get it, if you'll shoot me an email and you can send it to the fellowship email address that I sent out with a link, or you can send it to the contact at michaelmannsecurityservice.com. I can send you some schools that I've been to that teach the basic process for those industries, and they're not cheap, but it would teach you how to at least do a basic assessment, if that makes sense. And if I didn't answer your question, ask another one. I'm proud of my CPS. Yeah, man, the CPS, I've got that. I think that's the CPTED certification. It's awesome. The CPTED stuff, I've got that certification. It's great. You're absolutely right, Mr. Franklin? I love it. But, the SEPTED stuff is more of it's more of a like compliance. It's more of like a survey thing, but it does work and it's great. Not a question, but just a statement. I'm a director for community services training and Federation oversees Jewish temples in 5 counties in New Jersey. As you can imagine, we're getting lots of temples considering having volunteers carry while in temple. We recommend against it for many reasons you've already noted. The other part is that they are going to be able to deal with the threat when it comes time. NYPD has a hit rate of 8%. Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, man, Gregor, you're absolutely right. I'm actually working in the synagogue right now with volunteers, and I'm trying to work them through the process of do they really want armed people or not. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And so, yep, it's always a concern. Man, number one, can they respond? What's that going to look like if they do? And number two, what's the risk look like? Absolutely. Um, what advice are you sharing for ICE raids and role of security? Um, oh, yeah, at a house of worship. Yeah, man, that's a good question because we're getting that. I'm getting that from a corporate standpoint too. So, you guys that are about ICE raids, really quick. Um, there are, if you don't know this, and Eric, tell me if I'm going off the grid here or whatever, off the rails, and I'll stop. So just remember about ICE, there are two types of warrants. There's administrative warrants and there's judicial warrants. Administrative warrants are specifically, or they're kind of loose in nature, and um, an administrative warrant can be signed by like an ICE official. It doesn't have to be signed by a judge, and it can be specific on something they're looking for, but it doesn't. But it doesn't necessarily allow them to search unless you let them do that. A judicial warrant does call for a search, and it does where a lot of times they're looking for somebody specific. But both warrants, whether it's administrative or judicial, under the Fourth Amendment, does not allow them just to come in and bust in and search for people. So there's an administrative process that you guys can go through if that happens at your house of worship. Specifically, if they do show up, and it could be a task force, so there could be some local police in it also, you have the ability to say, hey guys, stop just a second. I need to see the warrant. Let me look at the warrant. Let me pass this on to my, to our legal representation. Give me just a few minutes. And also I want to see, is it signed? And exactly who are you looking for? Because who you're looking for may not even be here. So you have the right to stop as they come in, right? Because they're not going to come busting down the door. They're not going to come kicking the door in. So is it administrative or is it judicial? Stop. You can ask those questions. You can look at the warrant. That buys you time. And so those are some things you can do. And understand, ICE is not going to come kicking down doors and all that. There are some Fourth Amendment protections that all businesses, which under in the state, the government, the church is it's a business basically. All states, that's why they look at it, just not for profit. So you guys have some rights. So they're not just going to come kicking in the door. You can stop. You can tell them to hold off. You can look at the warrant. You can make sure it's signed, especially a judicial warrant, because it's got to be signed by a magistrate for it to be legal. You can look at all those things. And Eric, if you got some other questions offline, you can always, obviously, how to get a hold of me. You call me and ask. But that's my, because I've already had to address that. Other than critical incident, yeah, Diane. Hey, Diana, just shoot me an email and I'll be glad to point you through those references. Other than critical incident community briefing video released by the Houston Police, has there been any other information releases, after action reviews, breakdowns of the lessons learned from Joel Osteen Lakewood Church incident? There has not been, but if you'll give me about 2 weeks, I'll do one. We just didn't look at it. In fact, Brandon, I think, told me to do it. Brandon Lurch is my media guy, my kind of right hand man. He's on tonight, and Dave works for Dave Ramsey full time doing that kind of stuff. And so I think he actually told me to do that when that happened, and I just didn't have time to. I don't know of any that I've seen, but give me about 2 weeks and I'll take a look at it. I just know a little bit about it, and I'll do an after action and put it on YouTube. Okay. What are your thoughts on Leo being uniformed in plain clothes? Man, that's a good question, Mike. I think if they're directing traffic, and if you buy into the issue of deterrence where there's a uniform guy in a car, if that's what you're using them for, do it. I am all about the mission of the church. I'm the worst sinner in this group, and for whatever reason, Jesus Christ has given me the grace to talk to you guys and speak in churches, in a pulpit, literally, in a sanctuary teaching security throughout the nation. So, and I don't deserve any of it. I deserve to be burning in hell. So, and I say all that to say I'm mission first, right? Like, what is our primary mission? That's to spread the gospel. With that, I'm not really big on uniforms. I would rather have plainclothes folks that are very nice, they're very welcoming. They could provide an armed response if that's necessary based on your threat assessment when required. But if you're using them to direct traffic or you want to use them as a deterrent, if you buy into that concept, then I would say, have them uniformed, have them in a car. But I would say that we have lost people that end up being saved, and in that beginning process, as that's going, as this is going on in their hearts and they're figuring this out, and the Father's leading them to the Son, or taking them to the Son. um, they may have a background where the police are not like, it creates emotions. And we serve people sometimes that come from locations of the world where the police are not good guys. And so there can always be emotions wrapped around the uniform. So I think if they're directing traffic, if you want to use them for deterrence or you need them, to make an arrest because you've had an incident where you need the police at the church, man, do it, right? But I would always say if you don't have to have it for those two functions, plainclothes are always better. And make sure they're not scary, and plainclothes police are always like a mixed bag. You can always tell the plainclothes policeman. So a lot of times they don't know how to fit into the environment. But so yeah, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, please ask a second. I've been asked to write an action plan and policy. Are these effective, and advice for creation? So yeah, man, emergency action plans. I guess that's what they're asking. That is, you're going to identify the worst hazards that you could have to respond to: medical emergencies, suspicious persons, disruptive persons. How do so like, hey, this is what we're going to respond to. This is how we're going to respond to it, and this is the training required. Absolutely, those should be that. All that should be written down, and they are effective. It is a process. That is a process-driven plan, and I agree with it 100%. Advice on creation. Um, there's nothing wrong with Googling emergency action plans and seeing what one looks like. Just understand that that's not what it's going to look like for your church or house of worship, but it can give you some ideas of maybe some hazards that you need to deal with, right? I can tell you the big ones. Like if you live in Tennessee, you need to be addressing weather events. You need to address, medical emergencies. And then your threat should be based on one, what your church has already probably faced in the past and what churches are facing throughout the country. So that would be my advice on, of what that would look like. Do you have any opinions on church safety team certification programs that are out there? Right now, there's nothing specific that I know of for churches. About twice a year, I'll do the APP certification, ASI certification for free. I do it through the Middle Tennessee chapter, but I open it up for free for everybody, and then I provide all the material also. And it's really kind of a part of a ministry because I'll talk about churches on there. We'll talk about Jesus, and so I don't know. It may turn, it may help somebody through a process, and so that's one of the reasons why we do it for free. But sometimes we'll do that, but it's a lot for folks. So if we've got your email address. We're going to add everybody on this that's on tonight to our like to what's we've got going on. So we'll add that, but I don't know anything that's very church specific that's out there for this kind of stuff. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. What are your recommendations for educating the congregation about the church's EAP and incident of active shooter? Good question, Diana. Here's what I would say, and some people can't do this, but I would, if you're talking about on Sunday, the way that we manage that on Sunday is the security ministry is in charge of the EAP. So the security ministry is trained in all the responses in your EAP to actually manage the EAP on Sunday. So they are responding to everything. And the reason for that is it's impossible, even if you have a small congregation, to try to communicate and go over what the EAP requirements are going to be to a congregation. It's impossible. Number one, they're not going to want to listen to it. Number two, you're going to take time away from the pastor, which most of the time, or the worship team. And God forbid that happens. That's a bad ministry joke. Well, maybe it's not bad. It's funny in my mind. I'm cracking myself up. So, but seriously, you won't have time to do that. So we manage that through the ministry itself on Sunday. Now, if you've got a big church and you've got staff there during the week, that's a separate EAP, if that makes sense. Hope that answered your question. Let's see if I make sure I haven't missed anybody. I think that's all the questions we had in the group chat. Any advice on how to address members of the congregation carrying weapons. Let's see. As long as folks comply with state laws, we allow concealed carry. I'm in Kentucky, so pretty much everyone can. Yeah, absolutely, man. Mike, I agree. We don't put signs up. We don't. The only thing we ask, and we don't put signs up for it, is they are concealed. Right? We ask that they stay concealed. One of the few times we've ever turned somebody away, as somebody showed up open carry at Christmas time. Our children's ministry was not open for childcare, and we said, "Hey, man, can you go put a jacket on for us?" And the person refused. We're like, "Hey, man, go put on a jacket." And they said no, so we turned them away. But we opened that up to everybody. Guns are not threats. That's the gun is not the threat; it's the behavior. And so we've got behavior threat detection process in place. And so, yeah, man, we let everybody come in the church armed as long as they're concealed. Do you have plans for dealing with known sex offenders? Yes, we do. And that is a couple things just very quickly. Number one, if we find we validate number one that they are a sex offender. Number two, we limit access depending on now on Sunday. Obviously we let them in the church, whatever. So this, just the first step process, validation they're a sex offender. Number two, we limit access to what those assets are based on what that sex offense is and what they want to be involved in as far as the ministry. And then we would set, and number three is we would write out guidelines, and I've done this for other churches. We write guidelines out for those offenders. So where they can hear the gospel and they can participate in ministries, but we also have to obviously, because of what their past is, we have to limit their access to those assets. So that's kind of the three-step process. Yep. As a counterpart statement, our CRT is armed. The whole team qualifies with tourniquets, wound packing, AED, zip cuffs, DT, OC, blah, 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 and tabletops, drills, synagogue, and 2 team members get extra quals. Our team members get a lot more range time. I'm going under stress, not cheating. Yeah, man. Hey, that's exactly, yeah, Bobby, that's exactly what they should be doing. If number one, everybody can do it, if that's what your physical security plan calls for, and people aren't getting hurt, and the insurance company says, okay, that's exactly what you should be doing. Absolutely. Is there any good statistical information or incidents to be able to reference in relation to churches allowing homeless to stay on property and how it increases liability as a risk? Right offhand, I don't know with ministries that are allowing homeless to stay on site where that increases risk. I would say, let's see, hold on, let me read your question again. To stay on, when you say stay on property, like overnight or like during the day, we're feeding them. What does that look like, Earl? Is that overnight or is that just while we're feeding them and giving them clothing? So is that for like a short amount of time or is that like we're housing them there? I don't know if I don't have any statistics on where that's turned into a bad situation. But obviously, if we're putting people overnight, then that does create risk if we don't have some sort of security and safeguards process in place to ensure that there's not theft, there's not a medical emergency, they're not starting fights. Because as most of you guys know, I know in Nashville, over 70% of our homeless population is mentally ill. And I know that because I provide contracts security for several homeless ministries. And so, as you guys know, it's probably the same in every state or every city. There's a big issue with mental illness, and so there needs to be some safeguards in place. So, right offhand, no case study for it, but there's some obvious risk for it if you don't have something in place. Let's see what else. Both lording on property during the day. Okay, so yeah, lording on property during the day, that's a no-go. If you've got staff there, if they're not there for a ministry function, then yeah, I'd have no trespassing signs up, no trespass orders, that kind of stuff. So they shouldn't be lording on property unless it's ministry time and you guys are giving stuff out, because we wouldn't let anybody else just loiter there. But yeah, sleeping overnight's a whole different issue, Earl. The things that you do need to address are, yeah, like medical emergency. So here's the risk. And if you're trying to sell something, here's how I would sell it. Number one, let's just from the ministry standpoint, number one, man, if they're sick, because if they're homeless, a lot of the homeless are not just mentally, like physically ill, like, dealing with that. So like, how are you going to deal with medical emergencies, especially if there's nobody on site? If somebody happens to pass in the night and that happens on the property, there's a huge risk to that, especially when you start looking at insurance, because they are emotionally pretty much if if they're, if they're mentally ill, they're in an emotionally confrontational state at all times. How are you going to deal with the physical confrontations? What does that look like? And then, of course, if they're staying overnight, what happens if staff members come in early, or if you have a congregation member that comes in to do something like a volunteer, and that homeless person is there, and that turns into an undesirable event or an act of crime. So you're creating risk for both the church staff members and people that may come in to do volunteer work. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff wrapped around that. Let me make sure I've addressed all the questions. I think I've got all of them. Yep, looks like everything, I believe. Oh yeah, okay. Yep. Hey guys. Yeah, thank you, Eric. And February 28th, March 1st in Franklin, Tennessee. We've got the armed certification program for church security teams. That is Friday evening, February the 28th. That's going to cover classroom legal stuff on how you arm your church security team. We're going to go through just the legal piece of it, and also weapons manipulation, insurance requirements, that kind of stuff. And then the next day, March the 1st, all day long in Franklin, we'll be on the range. And so in that, you will get, in the state of Tennessee, you can get, especially if you already have an unarmed license, you can get your armed security guard license with that certification. And everybody that also attends will get their Tennessee CCP certification if you wish to do so. And that is on our website, and you can register for it. Thanks, Eric. My senior pastor does not like locks on interior doors due to abuse of kids. Where is balance, you think, for countering active violent sex abuse from volunteer staff? Senior pastor does not like locks on interior doors. Yeah, there's a reason for that. So yeah, there's a couple of reasons why pastors don't do that, especially if they're coming from, obviously long-time church, and especially from the educational environment also. So we're talking about Sunday. This is really where, because somebody asked the question, it might have been you, like, about sexual predators or sex offenders and how you deal with that. If we're talking about on Sunday, this is where your security ministry, and then also cross training your children's ministry volunteers with some security related stuff. This is where they're watching that, and you guys have got, in the children's ministry, just specifically, have really good procedures and processes on, like, children not being alone when they go to the restroom, what they look like what we call the two-man rule, where if a child that's under a certain age goes to the restroom, then there always must be two volunteers that go with them, right? So somebody to check the bathroom and somebody to stay outside to secure it. So this just gets into two things: your volunteers, what they're looking for outside of the active assailant, which is, potential sexual predators, and then the processes and procedures that your children's ministry has in place. I'm not real big on the locks either. Now, for active assailant lockdown, there can be other measures, that you can buy. Now, they're expensive, but where you can go into lockdown procedures for that. But as far as, man, where's the balance for it? You kind of have to deal with that with your emergency action plan, right? So maybe the rule is, if you've got locks on the door, you can't use those locks on Sunday. Maybe the pastor buys off on that. But during the week, you've got a preschool there and you're worried about active assailant events, or if an active assailant comes in, that's what you're going to use them for. So whether that's somehow there's a policy that's written around that program to where you're not going to use them on Sunday, and then they're only used for very specific things, or very specific events, that's a way that you could address it. But I completely understand where he's coming from on it. Yep, and there's the if you're looking for the church security, armed church security certification, Brandon's put that in the link there. Any other questions? I think I've got it. All right, I think that's everybody. It is almost 1900, so we've been at right almost at 7 o'clock. I think I said we were going to do this for right an hour and a half. Now, thank you, man. We really appreciate you. God bless you, brother. You guys be careful. If you need something, shoot me an email. Okay. If I don't see any other questions here. If I don't have any more, thank you, Diana. Be sure to shoot me that email. I'll answer it for you. Yeah, Leon, get on there. I guess you better register for it since you're hosting it, right? So I know that the host is coming. All right.
Small things.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Leon is the security lead there at the church that's hosting the course. So it'd be good for Leon to sign up. All right. Anybody else? Hey, folks. Now, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Franklin. We appreciate you, brother. All right. If there's nothing else, we appreciate you. Shoot us an email if you got any questions. We got a ton of videos on our resource page. If you just go to videos, bunch of case studies there. Guys, thank you, Eric. Give me about a week and a half to 2 weeks. I'll do a breakdown and we'll send out the case study of the shooting at the Joel Osteen location. We'll talk about that, let you the lessons learned on it, and tell you our opinions on it. All right, folks, that's all I've got.